The vaulted chamber of the Galactic Exchange Court had been built to make every delegate feel small before the law, but the law had long ago learned to bow when the Krellix Merchant League entered in force. Their brokers arrived in black-sealed procession, 6-meter standards trailing account sigils older than most stellar republics, and the chamber's translation halos shifted to their preferred frequency without a vote. Even that small surrender carried meaning. Access adjusted itself around Krellix's convenience. Procedure bent. Delay fees appeared for everyone else. High Commander Varric Blake stood at the central dais with the stillness of a predator, certain the cage belonged to him. The Krellix were narrow-shouldered and tall, their chitinous mantle plates polished to mercantile sheen, each plate etched with contract victories, as if legal predation were military honor. 3 centuries of lane control had taught them a simple philosophy. Whoever owned certainty owned hunger, medicine, and time. The Meridian equation had remained unsolved beyond their sealed think tanks for generations, and because stable hyperlane windows depended on it, the League could decide which worlds prospered and which ones paid for risky detours through sheer heavy corridors. On the lower tiers, the smaller delegations watched in tense silence. Valari bead collars dimmed to gray in stress. The scholars of Lum tapped private notes under the table lip. Human observers sat in uniform dark suits, expressionless enough to irritate anyone looking for fear. Blake activated the chamber record and spoke with ceremonial patience that never reached his eyes. Let this emergency tariff session reflect the obvious market correction. Human carriers have exceeded their charter standing, violated transit discipline, and encouraged lesser polities to challenge recognized custodial expertise. The League therefore imposes risk-adjusted surcharges on all human-flagged cargo, effective next dawn cycle, with seizure provisions for delayed compliance and debt recapture authority under Exchange Statute 9. He paused to let the legal language settle like ash. Then he turned from law to contempt. For those still pretending confusion, he said, voice amplified across the tiers, the matter is not political. It is cognitive. Meridian stability is theorem culture. It is not solved by dock improvisation, tool use, or stubbornness. Humans remain competent loaders, useful in dangerous secondary corridors where expendability and physical tolerance are assets. That is their comparative function. They are numerate children with heavy machinery. It has been indulged for too long. A ripple moved through the chamber, not shock but weary recognition. The Krellix never hid what they believed. They institutionalized it. Broker speaker Telencor, seated behind Blake, added with a dry click of mandibles, the phrase used by our insurance forms was dock apes with ledger access. It was considered impolite. Today it appears accurate. A few Krellix aides gave restrained amusement taps on their armrests. No formal censure followed. The court-martial glanced toward the judicial bench where 3 review arbiters, all creditors to League escrow accounts, looked down at their tablets as if studying neutral weather reports. That was the practical architecture of Krellix supremacy. They did not conquer by bombardment first. They conquered by contract language, collateral triggers, and judges who owed them liquidity lines. Blake resumed. The League has tolerated human theatrics through 200 treaty years because disruption remained localized. That era is closed. Surcharges begin at dawn. Convoys in arrears transfer by lien. Relief fleets carrying collateralized aid are subject to immediate hold if payment schedules slip by 1 day. Default is not tragedy. Default is data. One of the avian delegates rose halfway, feathers flattened in alarm. You would seize food medicine caravans over timing variance during lane storms. That breaches humanitarian carve-outs. Blake answered without turning. No carve-out survives insolvency. The avian sat. The chamber grew quieter. By late third quarter that year, 11 frontier habitats already balanced on narrow supply margins, and everyone in the room knew what timing variance meant in practice. A delayed convoy could cascade into rationing within 48 hours. A rationing cycle could trigger population flight. Flight into unstable lanes meant salvage claims, debt inheritance, and eventually League-administered consolidation. The model was old and brutally efficient. Human trade envoy Lena Patel requested speaking time under procedural rule. She was granted 60 seconds, the minimum. "Let the record reflect," Patel said, each word clean and level, "that the united human systems contests both factual basis and jurisdictional scope of these measures, and will file emergency challenge under reciprocal transit law." Blake inclined his head as though indulging classroom participation. "File what you wish. Court review calendars are crowded. Your colonies may find hunger less patient than process." He dismissed her time with a hand signal before the 60 seconds expired. When the session recessed, Krellick's representatives flowed out through the priority corridor, and security drones cleared the way as if for royalty. Behind them came the practical consequences, already moving through data channels: injunction packets against human shipping cooperatives, escrow freezes on colonial credit pools, and provisional seizure warrants for 6 major junction depots. The League had not waited for argument. Their legal strike had launched before Blake spoke the first sentence. In a private annex overlooking the chamber's star-glass dome, Blake met his strategic advisory cell from the Meridian Directorate. Their lead analyst projected layered forecasts in pale blue bands. Every model converged on the same outcome. Human compliance probability after initial shock remains 87%, the analyst said. Their civilian logistics lack access to stable class Meridian corridors. If they attempt secondary rerouting, projected throughput loss exceeds 32% within 2 days. Colony credit failures then force negotiated submission. We recommend publicized seizures to accelerate morale collapse. Blake folded his hands behind his back. And military risk. Negligible if limited to enforcement flotillas. Humans posture well in committees, but their doctrine values preservation and optics. They do not burn trade architectures because they still need admission. Another advisor, older, with scarred mantle ridges from earlier anti-piracy campaigns, hesitated before speaking. There is one uncertainty. Human adaptability has exceeded baseline assumptions in prior technical disputes. Their educational culture appears less specialized, yet they produce atypical conceptual leaps. Blake gave him a flat look. Atypical leaps do not solve meridian boundary turbulence by dawn. No, High Commander. Then remove sentimental variables. We are managing labor primates with cargo hulls. He ended the meeting with seizure authorizations and a ceremonial message package for wider broadcast. The package included deliberate phrasing, crafted to travel through every market feed, primitive arithmetic, emotional governance, inevitable default, language as weapon, repeated until it felt like math. Across the station ring, the human diplomatic suite operated in disciplined silence that was not surrender. Ambassador Elena Morrison stood before a live wall of incoming injunctions, convoy maps, and tribunal response times. Her gray jacket remained immaculate despite a 16-hour session cycle, and the calm in her voice had the weight of someone who measured consequences before she measured volume. "Confirm colony exposure," she said. Analyst Juno Weber brought up the map. 11 habitats at acute risk if seizures execute on schedule. 6 junction closures would isolate 2 medical supply chains by local dusk. We can cover partial gaps using reserve tenders for 40 hours, maybe 50, if no weather spikes. Morrison turned to Commander Raffi Sullivan, liaison from Fleet Logistics. Can we move civilian traffic around primary locks without triggering military interpretation? We can move, Sullivan said. The question is efficiency. Their models assume we cannot preserve volume through micro-jump stitching. They may be wrong. Morrison's expression did not change, but the room registered the shift. Wrong by how much had not yet been tested at this scale. From the far table, legal architect Nia Becker slid a data wafer into the central projector. The League filed through all 3 Krelix-aligned review benches as expected. We anticipated that route. Counterfilings are drafted, but even expedited review loses to dawn execution windows. We need simultaneous legal and systems action if we intend to protect convoys in motion. Proceed, Morrison said. No theatrics, no unauthorized strikes. We hold record integrity while we hold lives. She keyed a secure line to Earth Defense Coordination. Fleet Admiral Marcus Hayes appeared in muted hollow, broad-shouldered silver at the temples, sitting beneath the low lights of command operations. He listened without interruption as Morrison summarized the tariff package, seizure schedule, and projected colonial impacts. When she finished, Hayes asked one question. Have they crossed from predatory pricing into direct humanitarian interdiction? They announced debt seizure on food and medicine convoys with one-day delinquency triggers. Understood. Hayes nodded once. Then, this is no longer a trade dispute. It is coercive warfare by ledger. Fleet groups will posture for escort under treaty language, quietly. Morrison let the line remain open a heartbeat longer. Marcus, they are counting on panic. They have always counted on that, Hayes said. They mistake restraint for fragility. We will not help them keep that mistake. The feed closed. A soft chime signaled incoming education relay traffic from Lunar Habitat C, one of the cultural channels Morrison kept open during long sessions because it reminded exhausted staff what policy protected. A children's mathematics competition stream flickered on by accident through a routing overlap, then stabilized long enough to show a classroom under wide dome light. Students arguing cheerfully over pattern proofs on shared boards. A girl with dark curls and a focused frown stood at the edge of frame, waving chalk as she rejected a simplification with visible offense. Sullivan glanced at the display, then back to convoy maps. Wrong feed. Leave it for 10 seconds, Morrison said, not taking her eyes from the injunction wall. Useful antidote. On screen, the instructor laughed and asked for alternate assumptions. The girl stepped forward, erased half the board, and redrew the turbulence term as a recursive memory chain instead of random drift. Her classmates groaned, then leaned closer. Weber noticed the notation and blinked. That is an unusual framing for her age bracket. Morrison allowed herself the smallest, tired smile. For any age bracket. The feed cut back to legal traffic. By station midnight, human teams had split into synchronized cells, diplomatic filings to preserve legitimacy, logistics rehearsals for non-standard reroutes, fleet escort protocols calibrated to defensive doctrine, and dormant cyber-legal contingencies moved from archive status to warm readiness. Nothing flamboyant was said aloud, nothing leaked. The competence was almost boring, which was exactly how Morrison preferred it. Outside the star-glass dome, Krelix banners still dominated the court spires, black against the trade lane glow. Inside the human suite, Morrison finalized a formal notice for full court delivery at first light, each clause precise enough to survive hostile review and sharp enough to mark a line no one could misread. For 212 years, humanity had paid tolls honored signatures, absorbed contempt, and preserved roots that others abandoned. They had learned the tempo of Krellick's arrogance, the cadence of delayed mercy, the way power called exploitation stability. They had also learned where systems broke when someone finally refused to kneel. At 3:10 station time, the notice left her terminal under triple authentication and entered the court docket with mandatory broadcast flags. In his private tower, High Commander Blake approved dawn seizure operations with confident efficiency, unaware that his own strategic assumptions had already started to erode at the edges. At first light, the exchange court recalled the emergency docket with unusual speed, and that speed told every delegate which side still believed procedure was a weapon. Blake stood where he had stood the previous cycle, mantle plates reflecting the chamber lights in hard bands, while 3 Krellick's legal clerks distributed surcharge appendices to benches that had not yet heard the final argument. Morrison arrived with no entourage beyond Patel, Weber, Becker, and Commander Sullivan, and the contrast was stark. One side staged dominance, the other carried binders and lived by timestamps. The court-martial recognized the human filing and granted Ambassador Morrison the floor under mandatory broadcast rule. She activated the chamber record, looked first to the neutral delegations and then to Blake, and delivered each clause with controlled precision. For 212 years, the United Human Systems has honored treaty obligations under reciprocal transit law, absorbed unilateral fees under protest, and preserved commerce through corridors abandoned by those now claiming sole custodial wisdom. Today, we issue formal notice. Release the seized convoys. End predatory lane tariffs disguised as risk governance. Open Meridian archival access to independent scientific review. If these demands are ignored, your monopoly protections end by our hand through lawful countermeasure, market severance, and defensive escort authority recognized in Charter War Prevention statutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The wording carried the weight of advance preparation and the far heavier weight of a state that had already priced the consequences. A low rustle moved through the tiers. The Vilari representative straightened for the first time in hours. 2 Lum scholars exchanged quick glances and began recording at double speed. Blake waited until Morrison closed the file, then stepped forward with deliberate, theatrical courtesy. "You still believe this is a courtroom contest," he said. "It is arithmetic, and you remain unequipped. You threaten to end protections you never created. You demand access to Meridian archives that your species would not comprehend, even if translated into your crude instructional folklore. We have observed your educational streams, chalkboards, story mnemonics. Children applauded for intuition. You call that mathematics. We call it developmental play. The League does not renegotiate with tool-using dock apes merely because they have discovered legal diction." He shifted to the benches and widened the insult into policy. "Let this be plain to every debtor polity listening. Human carriers now incur total surcharge at all League-administered junctions. Asset seizures begin at dawn cycle, scheduled and public. Any convoy under human guarantee that misses payment timing by 1 day transfers by lien. Any court challenge proceeds through standard calendars. If your medicine runs late, petition gravity." No censure followed. The review arbiters registered the tariff packet without comment. Morrison tapped her console and requested immediate injunction under humanitarian carve-out. The system accepted filing and returned a hearing date 5 cycles later. Blake watched the date populate her screen and smiled in profile, as if the machine itself had endorsed his thesis. Patel leaned toward Morrison and spoke without moving her lips. "They preloaded all 6 junction warrants. Execution scripts are already live." "I know," Morrison said. The avian delegate who had objected the previous session, tried again, this time invoking famine prevention statute by article and precedent number. Blake cut him off with a procedural objection. The arbiters sustained it, and the session adjourned less than 6 minutes later. Krellick's banners rotated to priority corridors, while non-aligned delegations were held in queue by security drones for traffic balancing. In the human annex, the calm turned flint hard. Weber cast a wall map of imminent seizures and colored each node by hours to shortages. 11 habitats glowed amber, then 2 shifted to red as automated notices confirmed credit locks. Sullivan spoke first. If they close all 6 junctions on schedule, we can still move through stitched microjumps, but only if fleet provides clean escort envelopes at each shear threshold. Civilian pilots can fly the profile. They cannot survive harassment while flying it. Becker overlaid legal architecture on top of the route map. Their injunction stack is designed to bankrupt, not to win review. We answer on 2 planes: public compliance filings to preserve legitimacy, simultaneous escrow contest and debt instrument audit to challenge fraudulent clauses. If we wait for tribunal calendars, colonies lose services before week's end. Morrison opened a secure channel to Admiral Hayes. His image appeared against the muted glow of command operations already in motion. They dismissed warning and scheduled seizures, she said. Total surcharge. Humanitarian carve-out denied by delay. Hayes listened, then gave the decision in one measured sentence. Execute defensive logistics protocol and legal counter-architecture now, with full record transparency and posture fleet groups for escort under treaty language. Morrison nodded once. Then, we are no longer petitioning. Correct, Hayes said. We are enforcing reciprocity. By station dawn, Krellick's enforcement flotillas moved with parade ground confidence. 6 major junction beacons switched from open to restricted status in less than 4 minutes. At Pylon Gate 9, boarding cutters latched onto a human grain carrier whose captain was still transmitting proof of payment timing tolerance. At Vesper Link, a medical convoy carrying antiretroviral synth cultures was diverted to holding docks pending collateral verification. Across 3 sectors, exchange court injunctions propagated through banking relays and froze colonial credit lines before local administrators had finished reading the notice. From the command gallery of the Krellick's cruiser, Ledger Spear, senior broker captain Gir Vol watched the operation map fill with compliance icons and felt the old satisfaction of controlled pressure. His species had refined this choreography over generations: legal pretext, synchronized seizure, cascading liquidity collapse, then dignified negotiations with the desperate. Blake's assumptions were not reckless bravado. They were legacy mathematics backed by decades of successful coercion. Gir opened the Directorate Forecast channel. The lead analyst, still in formal mantle, reported with the serenity of someone reading weather tables. Projected human throughput loss at a current closure saturation stands at 34% by cycle end. Frontier habitats enter ration thresholds within 41 hours. Expected human request for emergency mediation, 91%. Gir gave a crisp mandible click. Transmit model summary to insurers and allied lenders. Market confidence benefits from precision. Acknowledgement lights blinked green. Around him, Krellick's officers monitored seizure feeds as if auditing warehouse intake. One human tug captain argued with boarding teams through clenched restraint. Another cut transmission entirely when the lean code finalized. Gir saw no strategic mystery in any of it. The weaker party protested. The stronger party invoiced. Then anomalies began to appear at the margins. A convoy tagged for reroute loss did not vanish from the grid. It reappeared 12 minutes later on a secondary trace no Krellick's planner had designated viable at that mass ratio. A second convoy skipped around a restricted node through a sheer corridor classified as commercially unusable. A third route stitched 3 microjump windows so tightly that Jir first assumed telemetry corruption. He requested validation. Navigation control confirmed real transits, authenticated by independent beacons. Human pilots are accepting turbulence profiles above their certified tolerance, an officer said. Jir zoomed in. No, their timing is too clean. They are not improvising under stress. They rehearsed this. Across the first 6 hours, more icons survived than the model allowed. Human-civilian traffic dipped sharply, recovered, then stabilized at a plateau that should not have existed under full Krelix lockout. By local midday, projected loss fell from 34% to 11%. 2 hours later, it fell again. Jir opened a private line to Blake's strategic office. We are observing structured reroutes through micro-jump chains previously categorized non-commercial. Request updated human capability assessment. Blake's adjutant replied, tone clipped. Assessment remains unchanged and continue enforcement. Secondary corridors cannot sustain volume. They are sustaining enough to deny fast collapse. A pause. Noted. Hold position. Commander Blake will address after aggregate data. The channel closed. On Helios relay watch, Weber stood beside Sullivan and watched civilian transits thread paths that Krelix theorem culture had dismissed as noise. Ship after ship took narrow windows, slid through turbulence, and emerged where insurance tables said they should have died economically, if not physically. It was not elegant. It was disciplined, practiced, and relentless. We are holding at 97% projected baseline, Weber said, disbelief restrained by protocol. Loss is concentrated in heavy bulk only. Medical and food corridors are still moving. Sullivan exhaled once, almost a laugh, but not quite. Their models treated our freight crews like interchangeable labor. Nobody briefed them on the part where those crews solved bad weather for a living. Distress traffic still flooded in. Junction harassment continued. 2 colony councils reported ration alerts despite the reroutes. Yet the panic curve Blake had purchased with legal force did not materialize. Humans did not request mediated surrender. They requested updated shear maps, fuel allocations, and escort windows. 3 days passed before the first non-aligned insurer revised its bulletin from inevitable human default to uncertain. That single word detonated quietly through market channels. Tributary systems that had accepted Krelix toll logic as a natural law began querying open transit alternatives. LUM research forums published cautious threads asking why non-commercial corridors had suddenly become statistically tractable. Volari logistics guilds asked for shared route packets in exchange for depot access and repair support. In the human annex, Becker reviewed a separate dashboard and allowed herself a tight smile. League escrow vaults are still visible through derivative chains. Their debt bundles rely on assumptions we can contest as fraudulent once we prove coercive timing design. Morrison looked from the convoy map to the legal map, and then to a small paused video frame on Weber's side screen, the lunar classroom clip accidentally captured during the night before. Chalk notation filled half a board. A turbulence term had been recast as recursive memory. Run that frame through Meridian Review, Morrison said. Weber frowned. From a children's competition stream. From a human mind that saw a pattern adults dismissed, Morrison said. No hierarchy, no pride tax. Send it to the open theorem team with priority tag. Sullivan glanced up from fleet timing windows. And if it is noise, then we lose 10 minutes and gain humility, Morrison answered. If it is not noise, we gain lanes. She keyed the command channel to Hayes. First clash outcome. Seizures executed but throughput holding at 97 with defensive reroutes. Krelix confidence is cracking, though not yet publicly. Request authorization for phase meridian and escrow contest activation. Hayes replied without hesitation. Authorized. Keep the record clean. Keep civilians moving. Let Blake discover in sequence how many assumptions he built his empire on. Morrison ended the call and faced her team, voice steady as tempered metal. They wanted a surrender script by dawn. They got proof of endurance. Now we answer the rest of their structure. Legal, logistical, mathematical, all at once. No grandstanding, no revenge theater. We dismantle what they built and leave trade standing for everyone else. Outside the dome, Krellic standards still flew above court spires, but for the first time in 3 centuries, their certainty had become a variable rather than a constant, and humanity had chosen to solve for it. Weber forwarded the paused classroom frame to the Meridian Review cluster with a priority tag that usually went to collision risk alerts, and every mathematician on shift sent back the same skeptical acknowledgement in different phrasing. They would look. They did not expect a child's competition notation to survive first-pass rigor. Morrison did not ask for optimism. She asked for 10 clean minutes of attention while convoys kept moving. The review cluster lived 2 decks below the annex, in a windowless operations bay where theorem specialists worked beside navigators and simulation engineers. Professor Elias Schmidt, lead for nonlinear transit modeling, opened the file, enlarged the chalkboard snapshot, and frowned at the turbulence term recast as a recursive chain. He had seen that symbol family before, years ago, in a rejected paper from a Lum postdoctoral team. The argument had failed because it treated lane noise as history-dependent without proving persistence length across shear boundaries. The Krellics had cited that failure for decades as definitive closure. Schmidt called over Dr. Katerina Novak, who had built half the human side's validation harnesses. Look at this substitution. She is not smoothing noise. She is carrying state. Novak scanned the notation, then froze on the erased segment where Imani had crossed out a standard independence assumption. If that strikeout means what I think it means, she is forcing boundary memory to survive across jump windows. That would change the admissible region for stable transit by an order we never tested, because every Krellics publication hardcodes decay to 0 at the interface. Schmidt already had the harness running. We test it now. In the annex above, Morrison received a short text from the review bay. Running child frame boundary variant against archived Meridian datasets. 5 minutes. Sullivan saw the message on her side panel and gave one dry breath of amusement. 5 minutes between Old Empire and maybe not. Morrison did not look up from convoy telemetry. 5 minutes between hypothesis and embarrassment. Let the math decide. The first run failed in 13 seconds, throwing divergence flags across half the grid. 2 junior analysts muttered that the child had probably skipped a normalization term. Novak rewound the frame, zoomed in, and found a faint chalk notation near the lower edge, partially blocked by a classmate's sleeve. It was not a missing normalization. It was a boundary condition indexed to preceding turbulence state, with a weighted lag she had never seen in published Meridian work. Everyone stop patching around Krellics assumptions, she said. Use her lag. The second run held for 42 seconds before drifting unstable in high-density corridors. The third run headed through full simulation length on 16 previously non-commercial lanes. Schmidt stared at the output, then launched adversarial stress tests, because hope without punishment was how bad models survived. By the time he started the 7th test battery, the bay had gone quiet enough to hear cooling fans. A red alert chimed in the annex unrelated to math. Another Krellics boarding attempt near Vesper Link. Sullivan rerouted escorts while Becker pushed legal protest packets into the public docket. Morrison watched casualty counters remain flat and kept her voice level while issuing updates. The station clock advanced 3 minutes, then 4. At minute 5, Weber received a live pull from Schmidt. Audio only, breath tight with professional disbelief. Ambassador, this is Meridian Review. We confirmed a viable boundary condition variant from the classroom frame. Repeat, viable. Treating turbulence as memory state rather than random drift produces stable windows in corridors designated non-commercial under league doctrine. We are still hammering it, but preliminary confidence crossed 89% and climbing. If this survives another battery, your 97% throughput becomes mathematically conservative. Morrison stepped away from the operations table by half a pace, the nearest thing she allowed herself to a visible reaction. Can you certify for operational pilot packets? Within 22 minutes if no fatal contradiction appears. Do it. She ended the call and turned to Sullivan and Weber. No external broadcast yet. Route to Fleet Navigation first, then Civilian Guild leads under authenticated emergency channel. We are not announcing theory. We are issuing route solutions. Weber nodded and opened a fresh relay tree. Attribution line. Morrison considered the paused frame for one breath. Name included. Full credit. Imani Reyes. Lunar Habitat C. The tide shifted in data before anyone in the court chamber understood why. Civilian transits that had been surviving by skill and attrition began arriving with unnerving punctuality. Pilots stopped requesting discretionary turbulence overrides and started filing confirmations that the new guidance envelopes matched lived conditions with frightening precision. A Volari freight coordinator sent a clipped message to Helios Relay Control. Human packet Delta. Meridian reduced our lane risk margin from catastrophic to manageable. Request legal permission to mirror immediately. By the second watch of that same station day, even conservative insurers were forced to update their risk tables. Corridors labeled loss certainty for a century turned amber, then yellow, then, in several cases, green. The line item that had kept small worlds paying Krelix tolls through fear collapsed into a question mark. On the bridge of Ledger Spear, Jir Vol pulled up 6 independent feeds to make sure he was not looking at manipulated telemetry. Every feed told the same story. Human traffic was no longer merely enduring pressure. It was optimizing around it in ways the Meridian Directorate had denied were possible under real freight mass and civilian pilot variants. His operations officer spoke carefully, as if wording could soften numbers. Updated throughput estimate across human and sympathetic carriers is now 99.2. Select corridors exceed pre-seizure efficiency. That is not physically coherent with closure saturation. Agreed. Yet arrivals are authenticated and timestamp consistent. Jir sent a high priority request to the Directorate for Model Reconciliation and received an answer from a deputy analyst whose voice carried the strain of someone speaking while staring at broken doctrine. We are examining a possible boundary reinterpretation leak. Preliminary indication suggests humans discovered non-zero memory persistence across interface turbulence. That should not be tractable without full archival structures. Jir's mandibles clicked once, too sharply. It was tractable enough to erase our leverage in under a cycle. He cut the line and opened one to Blake's tower directly, bypassing etiquette layers. The channel remained pending for 9 seconds before connecting. High Commander, enforcement outcomes no longer match strategic assumptions. We require authority to adapt posture. Blake stood in profile against the tower's dark glass, unreadable. Define adapt. Shift from economic coercion to selective interdiction of guidance nodes and relay mirrors before route innovation propagates. A long pause followed. Then Blake answered with measured contempt that felt more controlled than calm. You are proposing kinetic escalation against data infrastructure during live legal dispute. That would validate every human accusation. Continue seizures. Our theorem cells will close the exploit. Jir kept his tone formal. With respect, Commander, this is not an exploit patch. It appears foundational. Foundations do not move because one species improvises lucky algebra. The channel ended. Across the court complex, non-aligned delegations started behaving like entities that smelled a crack in a wall everyone had pretended was load-bearing. Lum forms requested access to the new navigation packet for peer verification. Merchant houses from PAX quietly asked human logistics whether protective escort terms could extend to neutral carriers accepting reciprocal transparency rules. Filari guilds, long careful not to provoke the League, sent formal thanks for emergency lane maps and attached docking offers at reduced fees. Becker watched those messages populate and let out a slow breath. The legal battlefield just changed shape. If Meridian exclusivity fails, half their contract architecture loses justification. Morrison replied, "Then we do not gloat. We document." She keyed another secure line to Admiral Hayes and briefed him in concise sequence. Child-derived boundary condition validated, operational packet deployed, convoy stability rising, market posture beginning to fracture. Hayes listened in silence, then asked the one question that mattered. "Can you defend the theorem under hostile audit?" Schmidt joined the channel from the review bay, voice steadier now that repetition had replaced astonishment. "Admiral, we ran 15 adversarial batteries including blind historical sets. It holds. We are preparing proof scaffolding transparent enough for cross-species replication." Hayes answered, "Then our center of gravity shifts from survival to dissemination. Proceed with controlled release planning. Keep chain of custody impeccable." 3 hours had passed since Morrison told Weber to run the classroom frame, and the station felt like it had rotated around a hidden axis. In Meridian Directorate Hall, Blake convened his senior analysts under emergency seal. Holographic matrices crowded the chamber, each one a scar where expected outcomes had torn. Lead analyst Perun Tal presented with clipped precision that bordered on defiance. "Commander, we can no longer attribute variance to pilot recklessness or isolated rehearsal. Human transits are following a coherent alternative solution class. If their boundary condition is valid, League exclusivity over stable lanes is mathematically obsolete." Blake's mantle plates tightened along the neck ridges, a Krellic sign of contained rage. "Obsolete is a political word. Give me technical certainty." Perun did not flinch. "Technical certainty is unavailable on this timeline, but confidence threshold for their model's utility crossed 90% across independent samples. We have no immediate disproof." From the side tier, a senior broker clicked his mandibles in irritation. "Then produce one. Our authority is not optional because a few dock apes found a trick." Perun turned toward him with the dangerous calm of a specialist cornered by denial. "This is the denial phase that destroys institutions. We spent generations pruning model space to protect a monopoly. They explored outside our sanctioned assumptions and found terrain we refused to map." The chamber chilled. No one spoke to a ranking broker that way in open session. Blake stepped down from the dais, towering over the analyst. "You are not here to lecture me on institutional psychology. You are here to restore strategic advantage." Perrin held his posture. "Then, hear strategy. If humans publish this openly, suppression becomes futile. Our best option is negotiated co-governance before they pair theorem legitimacy with legal retaliation. If we escalate blindly, we convert market dispute into war under conditions we did not model." "War," the senior broker said with a dry laugh, against accountants with escort frigates. Perun's eyes did not leave Blake. Against a species that rehearsed survival in corridors we called uninhabitable and built contingency law stacks while we rehearsed insults. Blake dismissed the room for 6 minutes except his inner command circle. A senior broker, Jeer on remote projection, and 2 security marshals. The doors sealed with a heavy magnetic thud. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the ceremonial register he used in court. What remained was cold operational intent. They are moving faster than expected because we granted them theater space and assumed compliance kinetics. That error is closed. We regroup on 3 lines. First, legal attrition. Flood the benches with procedural challenges to any non-league theorem certification and force delay wherever signatures matter. Second, information warfare. Seed doubts about safety of human guidance packets. Emphasize untested risk. Push insurers toward caution. Third, physical leverage. Identify every relay and mirror supporting their navigation dissemination. We prepare seizure teams under anti-piracy pretext. Jeer's projection flickered as shipboard interference crossed the link. Commander, selective seizures may trigger direct fleet response. They already posture for it, Blake said. The difference now is whether we choose battlefield geometry or accept theirs. The senior broker inclined his head. And the child, the one attached to the proof. Blake's expression remained flat. Do not touch civilians, not because of ethics, because it would unite every neutral house against us inside an hour. We break structures, not mascots. For the first time that day, Jeer heard something like uncertainty beneath the command certainty. Blake believed in control, but he had begun speaking in contingencies rather than inevitabilities. By early station evening, Krellick's channels broadcast polished statements declaring confidence in League mathematics and warning partners against experimental human shortcuts. The language was careful, almost parental. The numbers beneath it were not. More neutral carriers requested human route packets than Krellick's temporary waivers. 2 minor lender blocks suspended automatic enforcement on League debt bundles pending independent review. On open analyst forums, LUM mathematicians posted a preliminary note titled Boundary Memory Persistence in Hyperlane Turbulence and referenced an unnamed juvenile source from lunar habitat C. In the human annex, Weber read that title aloud with a look halfway between pride and disbelief. Sullivan, eyes still on escort telemetry, said, "They called us children. We sent them homework." Morrison allowed the line to stand for exactly 1 second before returning to tasking. Keep discipline. This is the first fracture, not final resolution. Krellick's command will regroup and come back harder. Becker checked the legal feed and nodded. They already are. Procedural storms across all benches. Then, we answer with documentation and throughput, Morrison said. Every convoy that arrives weakens their narrative. A secure update from lunar habitat C appeared on her private channel. The school administration had been notified that a student contribution might hold interstellar significance and requested guidance on media shielding and personal privacy. Morrison forwarded immediate protection protocols, scholarship guarantees, and a simple message for Imani Reyes and her family. Your work is being validated by experts across multiple systems. You are safe. Keep learning. The reply came from the school director within minutes. Understood. She asked whether the adults finally stopped yelling. Morrison read it twice before setting the screen dark. On Ledger Spear, Jeer watched new orders arrive from Blake's tower, each one an admission, disguised as aggression. Additional enforcement cutters, expanded electronic interdiction authority, legal attachés assigned directly to ship command. The League was no longer applying a familiar script. It was improvising under pressure, and Krellick's institutions were not built for improvisation. He addressed his bridge crew in the formal cadence of command, 40 words that carried both discipline and unease. We continue operations under revised directives. Maintain seizure protocol, avoid unauthorized escalation, record every interaction, and prepare for contested maneuver environments beyond legacy Meridian assumptions. His officers acknowledged. No one sounded convinced. Through the forward display, trade lanes burned as thin white arcs across black depth, each arc now less like property and more like shared terrain no single empire could pretend to own forever. Jir felt the old certainty recede, not vanish but retreat, and in its place came a non-trivial recognition he would never have voiced in front of Blake. The humans had not won. Not yet. But they had moved the contest from obedience to adaptation, and that was a field where Krellick's arrogance bought very little. The next set of orders from human command did not go to warships first. They went to teachers, port authorities, civilian navigation guilds, and every non-aligned science forum willing to sign a transparency covenant. In the Helios Relay Operations Bay, Weber watched the release queue fill with destination tags that would have been unthinkable one cycle earlier. LUM Academic Mesh, Volari Cooperative Dispatch, PAX Independent Insurers, Avian Humanitarian Carriers, and 2 quiet channels marked only as anonymous frontier depots. Each packet carried the same core bundle, the complete Meridian boundary proof with full derivation, open simulation tools with public test datasets, pilot training overlays for incremental adoption, a legal declaration forbidding exclusive ownership claims by any single state, including humanity. Schmidt read the final checksum aloud while Novak verified chain of custody seals. Kernel version. Meridian Open 1 authenticated. Attribution line preserved. Source conceptual contribution recorded as Imani Reyes, Lunar Habitat Sea Competition Stream. Sullivan folded his arms and gave the display a look that mixed fatigue with satisfaction. 3 centuries of toll sovereignty broken by a school board and adult supervision. Morrison did not smile this time. She reviewed the public preface one last pass, then recorded the statement herself because she wanted no ambiguity in tone. To all signatory and non-signatory systems, the United Human Systems releases this theorem and navigation framework without fee, without exclusivity, and without retroactive licensing claims. Safety depends on replication, critique, and shared stewardship. Any polity that uses this package must preserve open audit access and civilian protection standards. Mathematics is now common infrastructure. She ended recording, authorized distribution, and nodded to Weber. The packets left Helios in 6 synchronized bursts. Across the exchange court complex, reception logs spiked so hard that bandwidth governors briefly throttled non-priority commerce feeds. For 11 minutes, the most traded commodity in known space was not ore, fuel, or medicine. It was proof. On Ledger Spear, Jirval stood over tactical glass while his intelligence officer patched together incoming fragments from open channels the League had never bothered to monitor closely. LUM researchers were already reproducing the boundary conditions on independent hardware. Volari dispatchers had validated 2 pilot routes and were submitting success telemetry in real time. A PAX insurer advisory flashed in red across his board. Effective immediately. Meridian monopoly risk assumptions suspended pending multilateral review. League surcharge-backed debt bundles reclassified as speculative exposure. Jir requested confirmation from Central Finance and received none for 40 seconds. The silence told him more than the eventual answer. When it arrived, the voice from Directorate Treasury sounded stripped to bone. Escrow confidence is deteriorating across 6 lender blocks. Maintain seizure operations. Avoid commentary. He closed the channel and looked at his bridge crew. They opened it to everyone. No one asked what it meant. By the end of that station evening, 24 systems had mirrored the human kernel, and none of them waited for Krellick's permission. The market did what markets did when fear pricing collapsed. It moved, quickly and without sentiment, toward whoever lowered uncertainty. Emergency session lights ignited in Blake's tower before formal summons even went out. Senior brokers, theorem directors, security marshals, and litigation architects arrived in overlapping waves, speaking over each other in clipped legal jargon and command dialect. A wall-scale display tracked defections in cold symbols, carriers shifting to open meridian routing, lenders freezing league enforcement clauses, neutral ports revoking automatic seizure support until debt instruments were re-audited. Peruntal stood at the center rail with dispassionate posture and a voice sharpened by vindication he dared not show. Commander, the release was engineered for institutional legitimacy. They published proof, tools, and test harnesses simultaneously. No paywall, no strategic black box. Every hour we claim fraud without disproof, we lose credibility velocity. A broker slammed his palm against the rail. Then confiscate mirrors, board relay stations, shut their kernel down. Becker had predicted that move a cycle ago, and Morrison had built her next layer around it. In the human annex, legal architect Becker activated a dormant panel labeled Lantern and entered dual key authorization with Weber. The interface unfolded into a lattice of contracts, escrow accounts, derivative chains, and tribunal filings, each thread marked with color-coded confidence scores and jurisdiction hooks. Sullivan read the top line and raised an eyebrow. You named a legal cyber weapon after a light source. Becker did not look up. Predators prefer dark accounting. Morrison stepped beside her. Status. Ready. We trigger on unauthorized seizure attempts against open meridian mirrors or protected convoys. Effects are reversible for compliant actors and catastrophic for fraudulent instruments. Every action stays inside treaty language. No hidden code paths, full public logs. Do it, Morrison said. Lantern propagated through authorized court gateways like a procedural audit request, because in strict legal terms, that was what it was. It challenged debt instruments linked to coercive timing clauses. It froze contested escrow vaults pending review. It flagged lien bundles built on circular collateral that Krellick's courts had ignored for decades. Most importantly, it mirrored the evidence to independent benches and non-aligned financial counsels before any single judge could bury it under delay. In under 9 minutes, league liquidity screens started blinking amber. In 15, they went red. On a secure call with Admiral Hayes, Morrison delivered a concise update, while data scrolled behind her like weather across steel. Open release successful. Replication confirmed across 24 systems and growing. Lantern active under treaty audit authority. Fraudulent debt packages now contested in public jurisdictions. Krellick seizure financing is constricting faster than expected. Hayes listened, then answered with the restrained gravity his crews recognized as commitment. Maintain restraint. We are dismantling a coercive architecture, not collecting humiliation. Protect civilians, including theirs. If Blake escalates, we respond proportionally and decisively. Morrison held his gaze through hollow distortion. Understood. That message, with only security-sensitive details removed, went to every human fleet group, convoy captain, tribunal clerk, and relief coordinator under unified command. It was not rhetoric. It was doctrine. What made humans formidable had never been a single fleet class or singular genius, though they had both. It was their ability to make diplomats, coders, freight pilots, teachers, and admirals operate from one moral and operational framework under stress without splintering into vanity projects. In a narrower culture, Imani's proof would have become a proprietary fortress. In the human system, it became a public bridge guarded by law, logistics, and force in that order. On Lunar Habitat C, Principal Director Sanaa Ortiz received a direct packet from the ambassadorial office with full protective protocols and a personal note for Imani's family. She read it once, then walked to classroom ring 4, where the evening session had resumed with nervous excitement. Imani Reyes stood at the board, arguing with 3 older students about weighting functions and looking annoyed that everyone kept glancing at her as though she had changed species. Ortiz waited for a pause. Imani, Ambassador Morrison asked me to tell you that your work is now under peer validation across multiple systems. You are under official privacy protection. Also, she says, keep learning. Imani tightened her grip on the chalk. Did the adults stop yelling? A few students laughed, then went quiet when Ortiz nodded in that careful way adults used when truth was inconvenient. Some did, Ortiz said. Some are still practicing. Imani considered that, then tapped the lower corner of her old derivation. They are going to get this part wrong if they forget the lag term when the boundary gets noisy. Ortiz sent that note to Helios within 30 seconds. Schmidt incorporated it into revision 3 of the training packet before midnight. From neutral space, anxiety became respect with remarkable speed. The Avian Humanitarian Network issued a formal declaration recognizing human escorts as lawful civilian protectors under famine prevention statutes. The Scholars of Lum announced open seminars on the Meridian Memory Model and invited Krelix academics by name. The Merchants of Pax offered temporary credit guarantees for worlds transitioning off-league toll schedules. None of these groups proclaimed allegiance to humanity. They did something more durable. They aligned behavior around the new framework. Krelix command, read those moves as encirclement. Blake reconvened his inner circle under blackout protocol. Jir's projection appeared from Ledger Spear beside 3 sector marshals and 2 litigation directors whose composure had cracked into blunt fear. Commander, one director said, Lantern challenges are freezing instruments we considered untouchable. If escrow remains locked through next cycle, we cannot fund simultaneous enforcement operations and debt defense. A marshal added, Neutral ports are delaying our boarding rights pending review. Crews report growing non-compliance among contracted auxiliaries. Blake stood without moving for several seconds, a figure of polished armor at the center of structural failure. When he spoke, the old contempt remained, but now it rode atop urgency. Then we terminate the dissemination node. Helios Array is the operational heart of their release and legal synchronization. Remove it, and their coalition fractures into local arguments. Parental answered before anyone else. Commander, kinetic action against Helios will be visible as war initiation. It unifies their legal case and legitimizes full fleet response. Blake turned to him slowly. We are already in war. They simply insist on calling it compliance. He issued orders in rapid sequence. Reserve Armada mobilization under anti-piracy authority. Strike groups concentrated along approach vectors masked as customs patrol rotations. Information channels primed to frame Helios as a destabilizing illicit node. Internal descent protocols tightened. Any captain refusing deployment would be charged with charter treason. On Ledger Spear, Jir received the mobilization packet and felt the bridge atmosphere harden from uncertainty into fatalistic discipline. His tactical officer, usually imperturbable, spoke more quietly than usual. Sir, reserve tonnage commitment at this scale signals intent beyond seizure. Jir kept his eyes on the vector map. I can still read numbers. He transmitted execution acknowledgments because refusing would end his command before the battle began. Then, after a pause, long enough to qualify as deliberate, he opened a private recorder and appended a sealed note to fleet archives. Strategic objections, raised and overruled. Operational risk to civilian lanes assessed as severe. Recommend immediate negotiation channel while still possible. He tagged it for release only if he died. At Helios, human intelligence did not need a traitor to see the storm assembling. Fleet sensors mapped mass shifts in Krellick's patrol patterns within minutes. Trade analysts caught synchronized insurance manipulation tied to probable strike windows. Becker's legal feeds lit with preemptive Krellick's filings attempting to retroactively classify Helios as contraband infrastructure, a step so transparent that even sympathetic benches hesitated. 3 days had passed since the classroom frame became doctrine, and each day had peeled away another layer of League inevitability. In Fleet Command, Hayes convened a multi-sector briefing with Morrison, Sullivan, Weber, Becker, and frontline captains projected around a circular tactical table. The room held no theatrics, only professionals carrying the weight of a threshold. Hayes spoke first, voice calm enough to make the words heavier. The crux is no longer whether we can endure pressure. We have already done that. The crux is whether we allow coercive command to reconstitute by destroying shared infrastructure. We will not. Rules of engagement remain strict. Protect civilians, target military systems, capture leadership if feasible. He shifted the display to approach geometry and meridian overlays from Imani's model. Lane shear probabilities rolled across the map in layered bands. Their reserve armada will trust mass and doctrine. We will trust prediction and discipline. They expect us to defend Helios in a single ring. We will defend in depth and force them into unstable vectors they do not believe in until too late. Sullivan leaned forward. Convoy protection during engagement. Maintained, Hayes said. Secondary escorts already repositioning. No famine corridor goes dark while fleets fight. Morrison added the political edge, measured and unblinking. Final warning goes out before first shot. Public, recorded, and legally explicit. If they stand down, they live to face court. If they proceed, they choose consequences on record. No one in the room argued. The warning transmitted across every League command channel 1 hour later, signed by Ambassador Morrison and countersigned by Admiral Hayes. For 212 years, humanity had accepted insult in service of stability, protected routes we did not control, and pursued remedy through law, even when law was bent against us. We opened the Meridian framework to all species without fee. We challenged fraud through public courts. We offered de-escalation repeatedly. Stand down your reserve armada. Withdraw from Helios vectors. Submit disputed claims to independent review. If you continue this advance, you are no longer enforcing commerce. You are attacking civilian infrastructure under open treaty. Choose now. Blake's answer came as silence followed by acceleration. Krellick's reserve signatures flared along 3 converging approach lanes, 2 coordinated for bluff, and 2 committed for negotiation theater. On Helios command decks, human crews moved to battle stations with the same procedural calm they had used for convoy routing and theorem release, as if this were one more branch of the same equation. The balance of power had already shifted in law, logistics, and mathematics. Now it would be tested in fire, and both sides knew the next 19 minutes would decide who governed the lanes when the shooting stopped. The first Krellick's salvo crossed the Helios exclusion line at 14:02 station time, and the tactical screen stopped looking like forecasts and started looking like consequences. On Admiral Hayes's command deck, icons bloomed in hard red clusters along 3 converging vectors, exactly where Morrison's final warning had predicted they would commit if Blake chose force over law. Reserve Armada confirmed, Commander Sullivan said from escort control, voice clipped, but steady. Primary tonnage massing on the central lane. Flanking customs groups have dropped pretense and gone weapons hot. Hayes did not raise his voice. Record this as hostile initiation under Treaty Article 17. Broadcast one final stand-down call on all open bands. Morrison stood at the secondary command rail beside Becker, watching legal and military telemetry overlap in a single lattice of proof. She keyed the channel herself. Krellick's command. You are inside protected civilian infrastructure boundaries with active weapons targeting. Power down, reduce drives, and prepare to submit for supervised arbitration. This transmission is recorded in full for exchange court and independent review benches. The answer came as another acceleration spike from Blake's flagship and a coordinated missile spread aimed at Helios mirror arrays. Hayes gave the order that ended diplomacy. All groups execute Meridian defense pattern. Ring 1 release decoys. Ring 2 deploy interceptor clouds. Ring 3 hold electromagnetic lances until my mark. Keep firing lines clean of civilian corridors. Human doctrine unfolded with the calm precision of something rehearsed far longer than the Krellicks had modeled. Outer pickets launched drone blooms that mimicked command signatures and engine heat, turning open space into a shifting false fleet. Krellick's fire control systems bit on the bait and wasted their first saturation volley on targets designed to die loudly. At minute 2, the central Krellick's column pressed forward, confident in mass and legacy equations. Their formation was textbook League doctrine: dense spearhead, escort lattices tight, command relays centralized for rapid arbitration override. It had bullied slower opponents for a century. It entered the first predicted shear pocket and came apart by degrees that looked subtle until they became fatal. Imani Reyes's boundary model ran in every human tactical computer, treating lane turbulence as memory rather than noise. Hayes had used it to map transient instabilities that did not exist on Krellick's charts. As the spearhead crossed those hidden gradients, navigation tolerances drifted out of sync between lead and escort hulls. Tight lattices became liability. Ships that should have advanced as one body began correcting against different futures. Now, Hayes said. Ring 2 fired. Kinetic interceptor clouds erupted from human destroyers as dense sprays of smart flechettes and micromass packets, not to shatter hulls outright but to strip point defense timing and force evasive maneuvers at the worst possible moment. Krellick screens lit with collision alarms. Formation integrity degraded another layer. On Ledger Spear, Girvol watched his own tactical overlays lag behind reality by fractions of a second that felt like betrayal. Why are central corrections diverging? He demanded. His navigation chief answered with strained disbelief. Local turbulence persistence is non-zero across boundary transition. Their predictions are ahead of our compensation loop. Gir gave a bitter click. Say it plainly. They are steering through weather we insisted did not exist. A human lance strike cut across the flank before he could issue a second command. Electromagnetic beams, narrow and disciplined, raked Ledger Spear's relay mast and 2 adjacent escorts. Armor held. Networks did not. Fire control coordination dropped from fleet-level orchestration to ship-local confusion in less than 3 seconds. At minute 5, Blake attempted to recover initiative with brute force. His flagship transmitted override vectors, ordering all groups to collapse inward and burn straight for Helios regardless of local shear variance. It was the right order for old Meridian assumptions, and the wrong order for the map Hayes was actually fighting on. Krellick's ships drove into tightening turbulence memory loops that amplified each overcorrection. Human decoys peeled away at the last instant, drawing heavy batteries off axis. Interceptor clouds kept eating missile locks. Electromagnetic lances struck command relay nodes with surgical contempt. Convoy lane status, Hayes asked, without turning. Green and holding, Sullivan replied. Secondary escorts report all famine corridors still moving. That answer, in the middle of a fleet engagement, told the whole story of human preparation. They had not chosen between winning the battle and protecting the vulnerable. They had built a plan that did both. By minute 7, neutral observers had begun rebroadcasting the fight to half the known exchange. LUM analysts annotated live shear anomalies with open-source Meridian references. Volari dispatch channels, once careful to avoid visible alignment, pushed warnings to civilian pilots. Stay clear of Krellick's collapse vectors. Follow human compact routing. On Blake's bridge, strategic confidence hardened into anger. They are spoofing telemetry and buying time, he snapped at his helm crew. Push through. Helios remains the objective. Perun Tal, brought aboard for real-time theorem support after the crisis deepened, stared at the data and said what no one else in that command spine wanted spoken. Commander, this is not spoofing. The memory model is operationally valid. Every minute we remain in this geometry compounds error. Order withdrawal while we still have coherent wings. Blake's head turned slowly, plates along his jaw tightening. You advised surrender in the tower. You advise retreat now. Do you advise kneeling as doctrine? I advise surviving to negotiate. Blake cut his audio channel and drove the fleet harder. Hayes watched the same choice arrive from the other side as a change in velocity profile. He is committing to the center, he said. Close ring 3 by 12%. Keep the trap breathable. I want his bridge intact. The resulting maneuver looked, to outside viewers, like human lines bending back under pressure. That impression lasted 40 seconds. Then the 3 defensive rings pivoted in sequence, and the Krellick spearhead found itself not advancing through a gap, but funneling into an engineered basin of unstable vectors, where every ton of additional thrust made command harder, not easier. Ring 3 mark, Hayes said. Electromagnetic lances fired in staggered salvos, targeting propulsion governors, sensor spines, and relay trunks with almost insulting restraint. Human ships were not trying to annihilate. They were trying to disassemble. Krellick's escorts began dropping out of cohesion in clumps. One battleship lost main relays and drifted broadside, alive but blind. 2 cruisers collided at low relative velocity after contradictory correction orders arrived, half a heartbeat apart. Boarding warnings, surrender pings, and emergency tow requests flooded channels that had started the day with conquest language. At minute 11, Girvol made the decision Blake would not. He opened a fleet-wide advisory on every channel he still controlled. Ledger Spear to all nearby League units. Local command integrity compromised. Reduce thrust, break dense formation, prioritize collision avoidance, and civilian exclusion compliance. A Marshal vessel immediately countermanded him with treason charges. Gir left both signals live. Half the captains followed physics instead of pride. On the human side, Morrison watched those split responses and spoke quietly to Becker. Mark Girvol's advisory for tribunal context. Distinguish command decisions from species guilt. Becker nodded, already tagging the packet. Recorded. At minute 13, Blake's flagship took the hit that decided the battle. 3 lance pulses crossed its dorsal array, then a 4th struck ventral relay conduits as it rolled to compensate for a shear memory wake. Its own charts still said should have dissipated. Propulsion did not explode. It failed in sections, one bank after another, until the ship's forward drive went dark and momentum bled into helpless drift. Flagship mobility collapse confirmed, Sullivan said. Command relay fragmentation across remaining League groups at 84% and rising. Hayes keyed open all bands with the same tone he had used for procedural briefings. Krellick's reserve forces. This is Fleet Admiral Marcus Hayes, United Human Systems. Your flagship is disabled. Your command network is broken. Further resistance will only increase loss. Power down weapons, transmit surrender beacons, and prepare for supervised disarmament. You have 2 minutes. Some answered immediately. Others kept firing in ragged bursts until interceptor clouds erased their confidence and localized lance strikes cut their targeting trees apart. By minute 15, surrender beacons began appearing across the tactical map, isolated at first, then in clusters, then in a cascade that told every observer which way history had turned. Blake still had not surrendered. Marine groups, Hayes said. Execute boarding plan on flagship. Non-lethal priority. Bridge seizure and command code acquisition. Human assault craft detached under escort veil. Threaded debris and drifting thermal wakes and clamped onto the Krellick's hull in 6 synchronized impacts. Breach teams moved with disciplined speed through darkened corridors where emergency lights strobed over dropped weapons and sealed bulkheads. Resistance came in pockets, fierce, but brief, and ended when human Marines disabled doors, cut local power, and flooded compartments with disorientation pulses instead of saturation fire. On the bridge, Blake stood at the central rail with one hand on a dead command console and the other around a sidearm he no longer had a firing solution to use. Smoke from overloaded boards curled into the overhead vents. Around him, surviving officers argued over partial telemetry and contradictory retreat paths that no longer existed. The bridge hatch blew inward on shaped charges. Human Marines entered in layered formation, rifles leveled, visors reflecting fractured displays. Drop weapons, their team leader ordered. Bridge is secured under Treaty Enforcement Authority. Comply and you will be treated under war protocol. Blake fired once, a reflex of rank more than tactics. The shot struck a shield panel and vanished. A Marine stun around hit his weapon hand. The sidearm spun away. 2 troopers closed, pinned his arms, and locked restraint bands over his wrists and elbows. He fought for exactly 3 seconds, then froze as he saw the bridge displays behind them filling with surrender beacons from his own task groups. At minute 19, the battle ended. Silence did not follow immediately. It arrived in layers. Weapons going cold, drives throttling down, emergency channels replacing attack codes, medevac routes opening where firing solutions had been. In the Helios operations bay, Weber removed her headset and realized her hands were shaking only after she no longer needed them steady. Hayes exhaled once and turned to Morrison. Military objective complete. Civilian lanes intact. Morrison's answer was a tired, hard-earned nod. Then, we finished this in public. They patched a live feed to the Galactic Exchange Court and every major trade channel that had carried Blake's contempt days earlier. The image opened on the captured Krellick's flagship bridge. Lights dim, consoles scorched. Human Marines visible at the edges with weapons lowered but ready. Through the shattered forward display, disabled League ships drifted under emergency lamps, while surrender beacons blinked like a field of reluctant stars. Blake stood in restraints at center frame, posture rigid with the remains of command. A surrender tablet floated before him on magnetic hold, its text already populated with unconditional capitulation terms, command code transfer requirements, and immediate stand-down directives for all League vessels. Hayes entered the frame from the side, helmet off, uniform marked by battle grime and nothing theatrical. He stopped an arm's length from Blake and spoke clearly enough for every court recorder to capture. For 212 years, we petitioned through your courts, paid your tolls, and protected routes you called beneath you. We warned you before the tariffs. We warned you before the seizures. We warned you before this battle. You answered each warning with contempt and each request for law with coercion. This is the result of your decisions, not our surprise. You will now order every remaining Krillix military asset to stand down, transmit full compliance codes, and submit to war crimes adjudication under independent review. Your crews will live if you choose reality. Blake stared at him for a long second, then let out a thin breath that carried disbelief, more than fear. You were supposed to be children playing with borrowed tools. Hayes did not look away. Children learn. Tyrants repeat. He took the tablet, rotated it, and placed it into Blake's bound hands. The bridge feed stayed close enough for the galaxy to watch the moment without embellishment. Blake's fingers, constrained by restraint bands, hesitated over the signature field. Behind him, one of his own surviving officers whispered something in Krellix dialect, too low for translation but clear in intent. End this. Blake signed. The tablet flashed confirmation and pushed command-authorized stand-down codes across League channels with biometric verification attached. One by one, remaining hostile signals dropped. Weapon safeties engaged. Drives powered to idle. Boarding lights switched from red to white. A final line appended automatically from exchange enforcement. Krellix military docking rights suspended pending tribunal disposition. Morrison stepped into frame beside Hayes for the closing declaration. This capitulation applies to combat leadership and enforcement assets only. Krellix civilian transports are granted protected corridor status under emergency humanitarian corridor provisions. Medical treatment is extended to all wounded without species distinction. Collective punishment is prohibited. Even in defeat, the contrast mattered. On the disabled flagship bridge, Blake lowered his head for the first time since the feed began. Not in ceremony, in recognition. His fate was no longer speculative power dressed as law. It was recorded surrender, binding code, and a cell waiting on Themis Station. Blake lowered his head for the first time since the feed began, and the bridge stayed silent except for emergency tone pulses and the soft hiss of damaged relays venting heat. Then, practical work resumed all at once. Secure command core and preserve every log, Hayes said, already turning toward his operations officer. Chain of custody tags on the surrender tablet, biometric record, and command code transmission bundle. I want this admissible in any court from here to Saul. 2 Marines took the tablet from Blake's restrained hands and sealed it in a transparent evidence sleeve, timestamp blinking in gold script. Another team mirrored his transmitted stand-down codes to 3 independent archives, including one maintained by the Scholars of Lum, exactly as Morrison had demanded in every prior filing. Nothing would vanish into procedural shadow this time. Outside the flagship, white corridor markers spread across tactical displays as human escort ships opened protected lanes for non-combatant traffic. Sullivan's voice moved through command channels with calm authority. All groups implement Mercy Grid. Krellix civilian vessels are protected status now. Repeat protected status, no retaliatory interdictions. Mark and separate military hulls for supervised docking. A destroyer captain from Ring 2 answered with battle-shaken restraint. Admiral, we have 2 requests from Allied militias to let them settle old claims against League freighters. Hayes keyed in before Sullivan could respond. Denied. We are not outsourcing justice to grief. Route those militias to tribunal liaison and keep them away from civilian corridors. In the flagship's primary hangar, medevac teams had already laid out 3 treatment lines under harsh work lights. Critical, urgent, ambulatory, uniform colors mixed without ceremony. Human corpsmen stabilized a Krellix gunner with thoracic fractures, while an avian volunteer pressed sealant to a human pilot's shoulder. No one asked which species had fired first. Blake was marched through that hangar toward a secure brig compartment, and he could not avoid seeing it. A Krellick's adolescent deck cadet, not old enough for command rank and shaking hard enough to drop his mask, was guided onto a cot by a human medic who spoke in slow translation cadence. "You are not under attack. Breathe with me. In for 4. Hold. Out for 4. Blake stopped walking. "Why?" he asked, voice rough with smoke and disbelief. "Are you preserving those who fed your humiliation for generations?" Morrison had followed the escort detail down from the bridge, still in ash-marked diplomatic gray. She answered before Hayes could. "Because we are ending your system, not inheriting its habits. Monopoly was the weapon. Your civilians were collateral to it, often unwillingly. The distinction is non-trivial, and we intend to keep it." For a moment, Blake looked as though he might speak again. Then he said nothing and continued toward the brig. 3 days later, under full public transmission, the exchange court reconvened in the same vaulted chamber where Krellick's certainty had once entered like weather. The banners were different now. League black standards were gone from the priority spires, replaced by neutral court insignia and temporary relief markers denoting protected convoy status. No one had to explain the symbolism. The court-martial called the first evidentiary package. Exhibit A, Unconditional Surrender Tablet, Biometric Verification and Code Propagation Logs. Becker rose from the human table and stepped through the chain with surgical clarity. The evidence sleeve passed from Marine custody to court clerk. Signatures displayed overhead. The command codes were replayed against independent captures from LUM, Valeri, and PAX systems. Every checksum matched. Exhibit B, the marshal announced. Lantern audit lattice, escrow challenge provenance, and contested debt bundles. Becker placed both hands on the rail. These records show timing trigger clauses intentionally structured to weaponize one-day delays on food and medicine convoys, circular collateralization across captive courts, and coercive enforcement under color of transit law. The freezes were not sabotage. They were treaty-compliant fraud holds with mirrored review access. Every contested instrument is here, including those abandoned by League Counsel after disclosure. A Krellick's litigation director attempted objection, voice thin with habit. Procedural overreach. The presiding arbiter, no longer League-aligned, cut him off. Objection denied. You will address the data. Then came the quiet exhibit that changed the chamber's mood. Weber introduced the original paused classroom frame, preserved from the accidental relay overlap, with full metadata and subsequent validation logs. The image of chalk, partial sleeve, and strikeout lag term filled the dome. "This is not presented as spectacle," Weber said. "It is presented as provenance. A 12-year-old student identified a boundary condition experts had discarded through institutional bias. We validated, published, and surrendered exclusivity. The court should understand the underlying dynamic clearly. Knowledge hoarded became coercion. Knowledge shared became stability." From the observer gallery, the avian delegate who had once been silenced over humanitarian carve-outs bowed his crest in visible acknowledgement. The tribunal phase ran for weeks, but the decisive moments were lived, not summarized. Girvol appeared in person and, under oath, unsealed the private archive note he had tagged for posthumous release. He had not died, so he opened it himself. "I objected to reserve escalation and recorded that objection under command risk protocols," Gir said, mandibles held rigid against old instincts of silence. "I followed orders after override. That does not erase responsibility. It does establish internal dissent." Perun Tel testified next. confirming he had advised negotiation before Helios and withdrawal during engagement. The older, scarred Krelix advisor from Blake's early strategy cell, the one who had warned about human adaptability and then fallen quiet, finally finished the sentence he had left hanging months earlier. I told him atypical conceptual leaps were not sentimental variables. I was dismissed. Many of us accepted dismissal because profit was easier than contradiction. The court did not absolve them all, but it distinguished architects from subordinates, designers from conscripts, command intent from coerced compliance. That distinction became doctrine in the final judgment. High Commander Varric Blake was convicted on recorded counts of piracy by contract, debt enslavement, treaty fraud, and unlawful attack on protected civilian infrastructure. Sentence: life imprisonment on Themis Station under interspecies oversight. No command access, no trade authority, no appeal to creditor benches that no longer existed. When the marshal read the sentence, Blake stood with the same rigid posture he had worn in triumph and defeat. He did not contest the wording. He asked for one statement and received it. "You called us theorem culture," he said, eyes on Morrison and Hayes across the chamber. "You were right about one thing. Children did solve what we did not." He was escorted out under white lights, not black. 2 years later, sunlight from an open orbital array spilled across the Hall of Transit Studies on Ceres Annex, where the first Open Lanes Compact graduation cohort gathered beneath transparent domes and a slow-turning map of shared hyperlanes. The compact had replaced League toll sovereignty with rotating custodianship, audited quarterly by mixed species councils. Humanity held this cycle's custodial chair and would relinquish it on schedule. That had mattered more than any speech to worlds afraid of a kingdom monopoly. Morrison stood with Hayes at the back of the hall in civilian formal wear, older by fatigue lines and easier smiles. On the dais, representatives from LUM, Valari, PAX, Avian Networks, and the newly chartered Krelix cooperatives signed route governance renewals in plain language no creditor clause could hide inside. Sullivan, now director of corridor security, leaned toward Becker as children took their seats at long problem tables. "Remember when they called us Doc Apes?" Becker watched a Krelix instructor hand out shared styluses to human and avian students without separating rows. "I remember we answered with paperwork, convoy discipline, and a trap geometry lesson." At center table sat Imani Reyes, 14 now, still frowning at sloppy assumptions with undiplomatic honesty. Beside her, a young Krelix student in cooperative blue asked, hesitant but curious, "If we weight persistence this way, do we overfit low-density lanes?" Imani took the stylus, redrew the term, and slid it back. "Only if you forget boundary noise has memory but not loyalty. Test it across mixed traffic, then argue with the result." Their instructor, a former LUM postdoctoral researcher, laughed softly and let them fight through the proof. During recess, Principal Ortiz joined Morrison by the observation rail and handed her a printed note, old-fashioned paper because the occasion warranted it. It was the preserved message from 2 years earlier, sent in a hurry from Lunar Habitat C. She asked whether the adults finally stopped yelling. Ortiz had written a reply beneath it in fresh ink. Mostly. Now they schedule debates and cite sources. Morrison folded the page once and tucked it into her jacket pocket beside a slim data wafer containing the sealed custody hash of Blake's surrender tablet, archived permanently in open compact records. Physical evidence, legal memory, and shared curriculum had all ended up where they belonged. Visible, reviewable, finished. As the session resumed, the hall lights dimmed and the star field above the dome brightened. Human, Krelix and allied children bent over the once forbidden equation, arguing over lag terms and confidence intervals, while freight traffic moved safely on routes no single empire could lock again. Hayes watched in silence for a long moment, then said, almost to himself, "For 212 years we were patient and called weak. Turns out patience was the stronger architecture." No one answered because no one needed to. The lanes were open. The convoys were fed. The prisons held the guilty. The courts were no longer owned, and under open stars the next generation solved problems together instead of charging tolls for them.